I want to welcome you to this Dean's Honor Symposium. It's been my honor to work with this talented group of senior undergraduate students who are working really on projects that touch on the major themes that unite us across the different divisions of the university. Not only Eugene Lang College, but also the New School for Social Research, where I'm a professor in the psychology department, and the design and performance elements of the school are all devoted to representing, understanding, and changing the world for the better. It's something of a cliche to say that as teachers, we never learn as much as when we interact with and learn from our students. And it's my pleasure to introduce this talented group of students, including James Cooper, who's involved in the BA, MA program in history, Irie Ewers, who is in the environmental studies program, Gabriella Wagner, who is in the global studies program, and Lena Znaiber, who's doing the BAFA journalism, design, and photography degree. And we settled as a group on the theme, what trends shape society, an examination of policy, fashion, immigration, and greenwashing. We're sure to learn a lot over the next hour. We very much would appreciate it if you remain with us for the hour, if at all you can. And Gabriella is going to lead off with her presentation on policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriella Wagner, and before I start, I just wanted to say thank you for joining myself and my colleagues today for this symposium. I would also like to acknowledge a few people that are here. I'd like to say thank you to the staff of Senator Andrew Lanza's office for being here today, Lucas Perello, who was my mentor during this whole process, and my family and friends who came out today. So during the summer of 2017, I had the opportunity to take part in the Eugene Lang Fellowship Program, and with this program, I interned with Governor Andrew Cuomo, and I also joined my internship that I attained on my own with State Senator Andrew Lanza, and I came up with the research topic of raising the age of consent, ending child marriage in the state of New York. So I just have a question for all of you today. What age do you think the youngest person in New York was able to marry at?
15?
It's actually, in the state of New York, it was 14 before this bill was passed. And now that it has been passed, I'll explain more of the rules of the bill, but now it got raised to 17. So the question that I decided to research was, which were the political, economic, and social determinants for ending child marriage in the state of New York in 2017? So now, even though child marriage seems pretty self-explanatory, I wanted just to define it a little more. So child marriage is the act of imposing marital status on a minor who is under the age of 18 to a legal adult. Now, one may question, how is this legal since they are a minor? Parents would give parental consent to a judge, and the judge would approve it, so that is how it became legal under the state in the court system. And since this is not only a local and national issue, it is also a global issue. So the United Nations has labeled child marriage as a human rights violation due to the negative effects that are imposed upon young women, especially children. And specifically, young boys are also involved in child marriage, but I decided to focus my research on women because the statistics prove that there is a higher rate for women being married underage compared to young boys. So now, what causes child marriage? Throughout my research, I've decided to focus on what caused it to see why this was occurring. And between the United States and countries internationally, there were two main reasons. It was high rates of poverty and conservative religious groups. So with high rates of poverty, parents were selling their children into marriages to relieve the economic burden of their family. And in addition to that, conservative religious groups such as Protestants and Mormons were the main two religious groups of why child marriage was occurring within their communities, and this was due to the belief that once a child reaches the age where they reach puberty, they're able to be married. Now, even though the main two ones are Protestant and Mormon, it was still found in other religions also, but these are just the highest percentages. So now you can see here, it's a chart that I created with the data that I found and put it statistically. So you can see here that with religion and poverty, the rates are extremely high, and this chart specifically shows between the United States and internationally. So it shows that the determinants of child marriage between the United States and internationally were exactly the same, reasons of why it occurs. And now here, we're just going to gear more to the United States since my project is mostly focused on the United States. In the years of 2010 and 2014, this state map shows that 15 and 17-year-olds are married per 1,000. So as you can see here, West Virginia has 7.1, Texas is at 6.9, and Nevada is at 5.9. And you can even see other states, regardless of whether they're located in the West Coast or the East Coast. California is being 5.5 and New York has 4.0. So there's still very high significant numbers. Now, just in the United States alone, between 2000 and 2015, that's only a 15-year span, over 200,000 minors were married under the age of 18. And specifically within the state of New York, over 3,000 young girls were married under 18. So in addition to obviously child marriage being extremely wrong, there were negative health effects that young girls are encountering within their lives. So for an example, physical health effects include HIV and AIDS, STDs such as HPV and STIs, and for women who become pregnant, there's complications during pregnancy. Not only is there physical health effects that will have its toll on their life, there's many psychological effects that include isolation, rejection, abandonment, loss of identity, and depression. This is because young girls are being taken away from their families, their friends, and their education, and are basically being put into a home to serve their so-called husband, and that becomes their life. They lose who they are, they have no aspirations, and they lose their self-identity. So now, knowing all this information, everyone's probably wondering, what is being done to combat this injustice? This is where my internships play a significant role. State Senator Andrew Lanza, along with Assemblywoman Paulin, drafted Senate Bill S4407B, which increases the age of consent for purposes of marriages. So it prohibits marriages of minors under the age of 17. Some advocacy groups in the state of New York have had some issues with this bill because they feel it should be 18, but some issues arise due to the age of consent. And even though it is 17 years of age, it's still better than having 14-year-olds being married. So even though it's almost 18, it's the step in the right direction. And also within the Senate, it was 62-0, so it had full support between both political parties, between Republicans and Democrats. Also in this assembly, it was full support between Republicans and Democrats, except for one member who was not taking part in session that day. So I had the opportunity to interview staff members of Senator Lanza's office and ask them their views and what they've encountered during this child marriage legislation that they were presented with. So I decided to ask them what determinants of child marriage they came across while doing this bill. And their responses included that young girls who live in areas of poverty are more likely to be married off to relieve the monetary burden that their family feels they are. In addition to their socioeconomic determinants, some religions were cited amongst their responses as a main source of child marriage. So at the time, New York also was the only bill that had been passed to end child marriage. But since then, Florida has passed the bill, so that's still only 2 states out of the 50. So I asked them, did they think that any other state was going to pass the bill? And they said that yes, because since New York is so progressive and it is the first state to mostly do a lot of issues and take them on, that it would be a form of a domino effect. And I had the opportunity to interview Senator Lanza, who sponsored this bill specifically. And I asked him the questions of why he decided to take on this bill, since a lot of people weren't aware of it and it hasn't been touched within legislation for so many years, obviously, due to the amount of statistical rates of children being married. And he made 2 significant points that I wanted to include in my presentation today. He stated that the act of marriage requires a maturity factor, and a child is not able to make that choice at the age that these children were being married. So now this just shows that they were being coerced into marriages and forced into them, and it wasn't what they wanted to do in their lives. And the second point that he made that I really want to focus on is that young women need to be protected, and this was a women's rights issue that has gone unnoticed. So now if we think of the recent protest for women's rights. We never hear child's rights being brought up in this whole discussion. I think that's important to relate child's rights and women's rights into one, because eventually young girls are growing into women in generations. So in order to give them the equality that they need, it has to start from childhood. So the question is, what still needs to be done? The only two states that have passed this bill so far, as of right now, is New York and Florida. Kentucky started to pass it, but it was unfortunately stalled due to conservative religious beliefs. This was also seen in the state of New Jersey with former Governor Christie, who vetoed the bill due to conservative religious groups and his supporters. And obviously more states need to pass this legislation that prohibits underage marriages. And within my further research that I'm going to do for my senior thesis, I'm going to research how this can change in the U.S. court system, because this is an interesting fact that I want to leave off on, is that the court systems don't allow individuals to divorce until the age of 18, but they were allowing young girls to marry at the age of 14. So there's a contradiction right there in the law. So I think that's what needs to be addressed next. In addition to states who don't have the legislation, they obviously need to take that first step first. But especially for New York and Florida, I think that right now that the U.S. court system needs to be changed, and that bill that will possibly be presented, hopefully, will change that. And I also just want to end that this topic needs to be brought to light to stop the injustices, and I think that bringing it to the forefront is extremely important in society today, because girls are losing their rights to be successful, educated women. So thank you. And now I would like to present my colleague, Lena, with her project that she'll be doing.
Thank you, Gabriella. So I'll be presenting on women's dress and positions of political power in the United States. With the recent 2016 presidential election, women's dress has proven to be extremely important in the eyes of the public. Much media was drawn to the fashion choices around the election. However, while both men and women in politics both receive attention on their looks, most of the emphasis is placed upon the women. Regardless of what women wear, they seem to always receive criticism on their clothing choices. This criticism on women's dress represents the ingrained attitudes Western society maintains of ownership and control over women's bodies throughout the ages. My presentation will uncover the ways in which women in high positions of political power in the United States are constantly confronted with societal expectations in regards to their public appearance and dress. To answer my research question, I have conducted interviews, analyzed primary resources, and studied women's dress throughout history. First, I will provide an understanding of the psychological reasons behind these social implications, followed by a historical summary of women's dress as seen through political female figures throughout certain points in history. Then, I will present an examination of the contemporary dress of women in high positions of political power, as well as the devout opinions and popular conversations formulated around those fashion choices. I will focus mainly on the public appearance and perception of Senator and 2016 presidential candidate Hillary Clinton as a primary case study. According to psychology and gender studies, women in positions of leadership are constantly facing a double bind. Men and women have prescribed gender stereotypes. Women consist of being kind, polite, sensitive, and cheerful, whereas men are expected to be business savvy, decisive, assertive, and good leaders. When either gender does not fit into their respective norms, they face backlash effects due to an apparent violation of their prescriptive gender stereotypes. However, this leads to greater scrutiny of women's leadership abilities. If women show traits that are associated with men and masculinity, then they are not held in high regard by both men and women. And if women conform to the stereotypes prescribed to them, then they are respected but not perceived as competent. Women in positions of political power are particularly impacted by this gender bias. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president in the United States in the Equal Rights Party. This was very uncommon, as women were exceptionally limited and constricted both physically and socially, ultimately rendering them from expressing themselves and acting freely in public. Few women overcame the roles expected of them, and even fewer pursued positions of political power. During this period, also known as the Victorian era, women were most commonly wearing extremely long and heavy dresses, corsets, and crinolines. This made it difficult for women to be active and sometimes even breathe properly, further enforcing them to take on the domestic roles society had predetermined for them, while men pursued jobs in the workforce and were accepted as leaders of society. For this reason, Woodhull chose to wear skirts that stopped at the ankle. She insisted that this was a practical adjustment, yet she was faced with much critique for her penchant towards shorter skirts. Woodhull was a militant feminist and leader of the women's suffrage movement who sought for equal rights and free love. She was also a newspaper publisher, the first woman to run a brokerage firm on Wall Street, and a prominent spiritualist. Yet much of the focus she received from the public consisted of an evaluation of her attire and moral codes conjunctively, clouding her array of capabilities. This sort of commentary, along with promiscuous scandals she was rumored to have taken part in, gained her the title of Mrs. Satan, a brazen snaky adventuress, or as one tabloid headline recorded at the height of her fame, the prostitute who ran for president. For all her revolutionary acts on behalf of women's rights and equality of the races, Woodhull did not receive any electoral votes. A few years later, in 1884, Belva Ann Lockwood ran for the presidential position, yet her candidacy was just as Woodhull's in that it too was followed by incessant commentary on her looks and attire. Newspapers called her Old Lady Lockwood, and men warned her election would bring on a dangerous form of petticoat rule. Men would even throw anti-Lockwood parades where they would take to the streets and wear Mother Hubbard dresses to protest. A Mother Hubbard dress is a dress intended to cover as much skin as possible. It was introduced by missionaries in Polynesia to civilize those whom they considered half-naked savages. Protesters wore the garment in the anti-Lockwood parades as a satirical allusion to Lockwood's way of dressing. Consequently, she too was left behind in the electoral race. By the early 1900s, women were finally allowed to express their opinions openly in public, as the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote on August 18, 1920. While women got rid of the heavy frill and lace of their previous clothes, they still kept to a certain dress code. In fact, women could still get arrested for wearing pants in public. In 1938, a woman in LA defied a judge's order and wore pants in court, earning her a day at jail. While women were mainly limited to wearing dresses and skirts, they began wearing pants in factories during World War II for safety and functionality reasons, and they discovered a new kind of freedom and comfort. Yet after work, they would usually switch back to skirts. Nevertheless, women up to the 1980s were most often restricted to wearing skirts and dresses to work. In the 1980s, power dressing for women developed. It suggested a gender-specific professional dress code directly resembling the male wardrobe that would help women to acquire authority, respect, and power at work. Despite the advent of power dressing, the Senate dress code still prohibited women from wearing pants up until 1993, when Senators Barbara Mikulski and Carol Moseley Braun challenged this rule and changed the game for working women. In 1993, the two senators wore pants onto the Senate floor, and the female staff followed. Additionally, they mounted an equal rights protest where they wore pants and asked their female staffers to do the same. As a result, later that year, the Senate amended the rule forbidding women to wear pants. Today, wearing a suit no longer necessarily represents an effort to camouflage with men, yet women are often still pressured to do so in order to receive credibility and authority. In fact, semblances of femininity are often detrimental to an image of power. Women in high positions of political power are a testimony of this today. During the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton made all of her public appearances in conservative, boxy, and loose-fitting suits with jackets that went down below her hips, concealing any sign of femininity. Yet she had not always been consistently wearing this kind of look. In 2007, she received much backlash for wearing a rose-colored blazer over a black top with a neckline that had a subtle V-shape, revealing a very small side of cleavage. More attention was brought to her slight acknowledgement of sexuality and femininity than the speech she was giving about the burdensome cost of higher education. The press and media took to their newsletters to write entire articles about Clinton's cleavage, like the Washington Post, who wrote a 746-word article about it. This article was written by Robin Givhan, Pulitzer Prize winner and fashion critique for the Washington Post. According to media watchdog website Media Matters, following this Washington Post article, broadcast television such as CNN and MSNBC also focused on Clinton's appearance discussing her cleavage. On January 20, 2016, Givhan wrote an article on Sarah Palin's sweater. In this article, she breaks down Palin's cardigan as distracting and a method to seek personal attention. Is there accuracy in Givon's analysis? Perhaps. After all, fashion choices are psychologically motivated and have meaning. However, again, this seems to pertain mainly to women because they get scrutinized on their appearance far more than men. In 2008, the Republican National Committee came under fire for providing Sarah Palin with a $150,000 clothing allowance. The attention this received in comparison to that given to Barack Obama's $1,500 suits or Trump's $720 Ferragamo shoes is minute. Looking back throughout Clinton's time as First Lady, she wore clothes that were more overtly feminine. During Bill Clinton's first term in office, Clinton was photographed wearing a black Donna Karan gown that revealed her shoulders. Donna Karan's intent to reveal shoulders in this dress was because a woman's shoulders remained sensuous and appealing regardless of her age. In December 1998, Clinton appeared on the cover issue of Vogue wearing an Oscar de la Renta gown with a boat neck and long sleeves. She looked glamorous, regal, and feminine. By the time Clinton launched her first campaign for the Senate, she adopted a desexualized uniform, the pantsuit. Nevertheless, this did not prevent people and the media to comment on her looks. Tim Gunn, like many others, critiqued her pantsuit as unflattering and deemed her confused about her gender. The pantsuit became the uniform for many female politicians, serving as an empowering paradox. In the 1970s, the pantsuit jumped in popularity with Yves Saint Laurent's famous Le Smoking Tuxedo in 1966. Women were seeking more freedom, and it would be in 1974 that Clinton was seen wearing a pantsuit as a young attorney. Women since then have relied on this formula, the simple jacket and a matching pant over a basic and usually high-necked garment underneath. The pantsuit became an item that represented the fight against long-standing cultural assumptions that women politicians were not as powerful or capable as the men in those same or similar positions. The pantsuit attempts to blur the line of gender that comes in the way of female politicians' success. The struggle for female politicians to fit into a specific norm, all while concealing what reveals what society deems inadequate, is one that is at the root of gender inequality. Its importance, just as feminism, is not only about women's rights, but rather inclusivity as a whole. Thank you. Now we have James Cooper presenting next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our panel to this afternoon. As Lena said, my name is James Cooper, and today I'll be discussing a portion of my research for my undergraduate senior thesis, part of which is concerned with the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan between 1947 and 1965. We should first start with a little bit of context. I began my research with my own family history. My mother's father, my grandfather, was born in Lahore, Pakistan in 1926. Both of his parents were illiterate, just like much of the country during this period, and in 1957, he immigrated to the U.S. to follow his brother in college. This is similar to traditional narratives of immigration following a family member to a new country. However, he did not follow these traditional narratives completely. Both him and his brother settled in the middle of the country, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as opposed to metropolitan centers on the coasts. They were enrolled at Indiana Institute of Technology, studying civil engineering. However, after a semester in Fort Wayne, my grandfather looked for a college program in agricultural economics and was accepted to study in Frankfort, Kentucky at Kentucky State University, a historically black college. After studying in Frankfurt for a year, he left to find an accredited program in agricultural economics, which he found at Oklahoma State University. Why am I telling you this? Well, while in Oklahoma, he met my grandmother, a white Anglo-Saxon woman from Tulsa. They married each other the following summer and began a life together. The question which sparked my research this year essentially was, why Oklahoma? Why did my grandfather choose, out of everywhere in the United States, to live in Oklahoma in 1959? I grew up thinking that he was the only Pakistani person in the entire region during that time. When I envisioned his time in college, I thought it mostly looked like this. If you can't find him, he's right there. LBJ signed the Immigration Act of 1965, 8 years after my grandfather and his brother settled in the Midwest. Until 1965, only 100 Pakistani immigrants were allowed in the country annually. If that was the case, my research fundamentally asks, if he was one of a select few of minorities, why would he settle in such a homogeneous environment to begin with? Well, we should contextualize this context a little bit further, beginning with the Cold War. Now, the U.S. relationship to South Asia during the Cold War is very complex, but to be brief, Pakistan gained independence in 1947 with the result of partition from India. Immediately following World War II, the U.S. didn't really even think about South Asia. It wasn't until the rising threat of Soviet interference with the Korean War in 1950 that the U.S. began developing foreign policy approaches to the region. Pakistan, after realizing the potential geographic importance by the U.S., the country was seen as more extremely relevant to American foreign policy. Pakistan shared a border with the Soviet Union and is in close proximity to the Persian Gulf and therefore the Middle Eastern oil fields. In 1954, the U.S. solidified its relationship with Pakistan by supplying military assistance in an effort to assure Western alliance and the ability to utilize the Pakistani military in the event of Soviet aggression towards the Middle East. Here, this is a great account by Sattar Babar on the relationship of such foreign aid between the U.S. and Pakistan, which I used to situate my research. The policy of economic control continued from the period of colonialism into the post-war period of neocolonialism. Foreign aid is designed to enable an outside power to influence the political behavior of the recipient. Now, we all know that the U.S. government is investing economic and military funds in Pakistan, but what does this have to do with Oklahoma? Well, now let's look at the Midwest. To my amazement, I found that my grandfather was certainly not the only Pakistani citizen living in the Midwest during this period. I found this photo in the Indiana Institute of Technology yearbook, where my grandfather and his brother first settled. I find it especially striking, these two different notions of Americanism. One, white men with their rifles, and the other, new immigrants from a foreign land, both on the same page in the yearbook. Then we have Oklahoma in 1959, in 1960, and in 1961. There was a Pakistan Student Association. One thing I noticed out of all of these photos was the striking amount of Pakistani women. So again, why are these people in Oklahoma? Well, I continued researching through the yearbooks and I found an interesting tidbit of information. Pictured here, this is Dr. Leela O'Toole, the Dean of the College of Home Economics at Oklahoma State University. If we look a little bit closer on this photo, we see, recognized as one of the nation's top home economics schools, the college offers degrees in almost every phase of work, ranging from family life to hotel administration. With the Pakistan government and the Ford Foundation, the division helps to develop 3 colleges of home economics. Well, I thought I had an answer, but now we have a new question. Why is the Ford Foundation involved with Oklahoma and Pakistan? Here, this is another page from the yearbook of 1961 at Oklahoma State University. Home economics at Oklahoma State University functions at local, state, national, and international levels. This is the 3rd year the division has cooperated with the Pakistan government and the Ford Foundation in the further development of 3 colleges of home economics. Each year, the division educates young women to serve as home economics leaders in several other countries where there is a concern for strengthening family life and improved status and education of women. So there is this element of the U.S. assistance in Pakistan, not only by the state, but by the Ford Foundation, a non-governmental organization. I argue this is a byproduct of U.S. internationalism and expansion during the Cold War to developing nations in order to prevent the spread of communism. From here, my analysis will focus on this specific program of home economics. Well, I went to the Ford Foundation archives in Sleepy Hollow, upstate, with this idea in mind. Home economics promoting global capitalism in lieu of communism, and I found some interesting perspectives. Here, this is a document that details the Ford Foundation's involvement with Pakistan. In Pakistan, there is an acceptance of the concept of the intrinsic worth and dignity of the individual. This is the foundation upon which democratic societies can be built. As a matter of fact, the people in the government of Pakistan have been attempting to frame a constitution following the Anglo-American concept of democratic procedures. Here, the ultimate objectives of the foundation in Pakistan are to assist the people of Pakistan to reduce national and international tension, to assist the people of Pakistan in developing and strengthening democratic institutions, and to increase their social and economic productivity in order to enhance personal and thus national well-being. So there is a clear link between the Cold War, the Ford Foundation, American institutions like Oklahoma State University, and third world countries like Pakistan. This is a program letter for India and Pakistan from the Ford Foundation in 1952. It states that the main objective through this home economics program is building democratic nations. I wanted to know more, so with a grant I got from the New School, I went to Oklahoma to do even more archival work. Coupled with the Ford Foundation archives, I found even more examples of this Cold War fear which led to international expansion, especially to Pakistan, and the promotion of democracy. Here, this is Dr. Leela O'Toole, the Dean of Home Economics, reading Pakistani script in the 1960s. Here, this is Dr. Maud Hood, a professor of home economics with international students in the 1960s wearing saris. And here, this is Pakistani women learning how to make slipcovers at the Home Economics College in Karachi. This document details the subject matter of one of the College of Home Economics to be established in Pakistan by the Ford Foundation. Here you can see that everything in the college, food, science, clothing, and textiles, arts, housing, human relations, teaching, and liberal arts are all bound by one thing: family life. It was this transfer of knowledge, I argue, that of Western democracy, a consumerist culture, and patriarchal family organization via channels of people, Pakistanis to the U.S. and vice versa, that American universities and philanthropic institutions supported U.S. global expansion during the Cold War, and consequentially supported the exportation of capitalism and democracy abroad. In this statement by the Home Economics Department at OSU, one can see the fervor in this sentiment. The university administration, the faculty, and the Division of Home Economics and others on the campus consider it an honor and a privilege to be associated with the Pakistan people and the Ford Foundation officials in advisement in the program in Pakistan culture, a country with rich historic background, intelligent people, and a fervor for nation building. Even further here in this document on education, the concept of spiritual, moral values, of nation building, of scientific development, of enlightened citizenships, and of public service guide the educational system funded by the Ford Foundation in Pakistan. And here, these three values of home economics students, better citizenship, better homemaking, and successful careers, all of them are evidence of democratic citizenships, patriarchal home organization, and capitalism. Here, I offer three observations by two historians, Robert McMahon and Inderjeet Parmar. Robert McMahon is a historian of the Cold War, and Parmar is a historian of international non-government organizations, respectively. Both of these sentiments shape my overall analysis. In short, the United States sought to promote stable, peaceful, and economically productive states that would be oriented toward the West and capable of resisting communist blandishments, both internal and external. Providing aid was therefore essential to help ensure the loyalty of India and Pakistan to the West. That's McMahon. Now, Parmar states the flows of people, ideas, and monies were the means by which foundations concretely built American hegemony, ensuring that third world elites remain within the orbit of powerful American and Western institutions. Further, NGOs are intensely political and ideological and are steeped in market, corporate, and state institutions. They are a part of the power elite of the United States. In fact, they may claim to be non-governmental organizations, but they are, as he says, steeped in the power elite of the United States. Now, while my grandfather may not have come to the Midwest via the specific channels established by the Ford Foundation, this was the environment which he and many other immigrants during the Cold War faced when they came to the U.S. Oklahoma State University is a land-grant institution, in effect, linked to the state, many of which are situated in the Midwest. And the Ford Foundation, as Parmar argues, is inextricably linked to the state. So what better place for new immigrants to become indoctrinated to American ideals and practices than putting them in the hotbed of these beliefs, the Midwestern United States? Thank you. And now we have Irie and her great presentation on greenwashing.
Hello, everyone. As James introduced me, I'm Irie Ewers. I'm an environmental studies student, and I'm graduating next month. And similar to James' sort of interests, I'm also sort of interested in understanding this role that institutions play in shaping society and how we, in turn, also shape these institutions. So I'd like to sort of frame this presentation around the concept of greenwashing. Please raise your hand if you've ever heard of this term and you have not seen my presentation multiple times. All right, so we have about one person in the room, so hopefully you'll take something away. I would like to introduce you guys to a few examples of greenwashing to really hit home the message of what this is and what this means. One form of greenwashing in which a corporation disseminates environmentally responsible public imagery or information without quantifiable environmental results could be the use of unsubstantiated claims. So for example, if you're buying a vegan leather jacket, that might be great if it is not actually made of polypropylene. So vegan leather can and is sometimes actually just another term for plastic. Another form of greenwashing could be the lesser of two evils trick, and this might entail selling cigarettes that are made from pesticide-free tobacco. Not necessarily the best case. Another form of greenwashing could be the idea of unseen trade-offs, and this one is a little bit more complicated. It would actually speak to the entire supply chain as a whole, and possibly to some of the sort of externalities, as we say in economics. So this could involve how much water is used to grow the plants. This could also involve the labor conditions in which this organic t-shirt is made. Do they offer their workers maternity, paternity leave? What are their working hours? These are really important questions to start kind of understanding the entire system. Another form of greenwashing could actually just be the use of irrelevant claims to market something that is already being done. So for example, this happens most of the time in products in the EU. For example, any sort of makeup that says paraben-free or cruelty-free, that's another fun one. These are terms that are being marketed, but they are already being regulated. So they're just kind of capitalizing on the movement. So I would say that this is my favorite type of greenwashing. It's the use of misleading images or green, right? There's images of trees on packages. There's the green coloring that really pays an homage to nature without really understanding what that means. I actually took this image straight from Coca-Cola's website. This one's great. A very solid example of greenwashing that you're probably all familiar with and you don't realize it happened in 2015, in which Volkswagen came under fire. They actually found out that their emissions were creating about 40 times higher nitrous oxide emissions than what was being tested. So perfect example of greenwashing to take home with you. And in fact, this information plays a large role in decision-making and in our institutions. This is sort of an example of my conceptual framework that I use to evaluate this process, in which consumers, like you guys in the room, and investors evaluate any sort of information. This information can be substantive, it could have true quantifiable impact, or it could be actually symbolic, which is more along the lines of greenwashing. We then make a purchase decision, which in turn validates that information. So the market, in a sense, is rewarding whatever information we use to make that purchasing decision. Then the company is going to just disclose that more of that information. It's a cycle, and that ultimately comes back to us as market drivers, as investors, as consumers, in a nice cyclical cycle. So in terms of consumer research, understanding, a lot of you're safe. There is regulation. The Federal Trade Commission actually is an agency that is seeking to regulate and prohibit certain terms being used and trying to quantify and qualify what that means. So in terms of a natural product, that's actually completely different than organic, for example. However, I would say that on the investor side of things, this information is still available and it's actually affecting decision-making processes as well. In fact, after 2015, the Volkswagen stock price, you can see a dramatic dip in the market. So there's reactions happening. In fact, you might be surprised to find out that there's an entire sort of branch of finance dedicated to creating environmental impacts more along the lines of what you see here, and to try to really stop or prohibit the sort of impacts that you see at the bottom. This is what you may hear of called ESG, which refers to environmental social governance. It could also be under the names of socially responsible investing or something called sustainable finance. And something you might be asking, maybe not, but what sort of information are these investors using to really quantify and qualify these impacts? What does impact mean? All right, so actually, As part of my internship last summer, I did a lot of this in practice as well. So I found a lot of this information. It's available on public websites and in sort of your traditional databases available to the public. You can go onto Volkswagen's website and you can enter their investor relations pages. If you'd like, you can find all the traditional financial information. You can find their annual reports, their 10Ks, something like that. You're probably not interested. But then also they have their sustainability scorecards here. They have all of their sustainability information. It seems really great and transparent. You can just click a link and you're here. And they even have reports that you might want to read. I read a lot of reports last summer. One of them could discuss certain scandals, and they could even offer responses to, or what sort of corporate practices have changed in response to these environmental social scandals. Here in these reports, you can kind of get a sense of what their core values are, what they're highlighting. The top, actually, I want to point to, says high risk management. So that's something that's a key component of sustainability practices. So what's happening here is that there is a sort of increase in demand for this environmental social data. There is a rise in ventures such as sustainable finance and socially responsible investment. And then there's also this cornerstone of what this really means, because there's no sort of standardization, there's not a sort of regulatory body that is mandating environmental disclosures in the same way that financial indicators are. So this presents a unique cornerstone for great research. In fact, my research as part of the Social Science Fellowship wanted to sort of understand this sort of crux. And if regulation were to be put in place to mandate sort of environmental disclosures, would investors actually react if there was an increased transparency? If we provided great information and said, hey, a company is greenwashing, what would happen? So this is sort of an overview of my paper. I wanted to just simply understand how investors, your traditional sort of stock market investors, would react to information. And I did this through methods that you're all familiar with. I actually just sent out a survey. I targeted about 35 financial industry professionals, and this ranged from equity analysts all the way up to a couple CEO responses. I presented a scenario, so I gave them some really great financial information regarding the stock price. I added in some temporal scales, like how likely are you to purchase the stock immediately? How likely are you to purchase this non-immediately? And then the trigger was I presented them with some false environmental information, some greenwashing information. And I wanted to really figure out whether their purchasing decision changed. I was surprised because overall, a majority of purchasing decision did change. So that is very good for me as an environmental studies student, thinking, yes, you give them the information and the behavior changes. In terms of quantitative data, that seemed to be the case. However, in terms of the qualitative data responses, it gets into a whole can of worms in terms of why that decision happened. In fact, the majority of the decisions that did change highlighted this idea of trust, this relationship that was existing between themselves and between this entity that they were investing in. A couple quotes just pointed out that decisioning changed due to misrepresentation. So the idea that if they misrepresent one thing, how could they trust them in some other things? Dishonesty and misleading information. So overall, in terms of this data disclosures, I want to point out that this idea of trust is very important, because as we start to create more and more data in this sort of process and responding to the demand, the easiest data to disclose is more of the process data. And you have a handout sort of illustrating this as well. The risk management approaches that are in place, what is the company doing to try to offset this impact? And this data actually might not in any term be related to the quantifiable environmental social impacts that you see below. So there's sort of a discrepancy in expectation of what this data is doing, adding to this trust, building to this relationship, but not actually seeking the outcomes that socially responsible investment, ESG, is seeking to do. So what I urge sort of everyone in this room to do is in your next decision-making processes, whether that's a stock if you invest, or whether that is a product that you're next to purchase, I really urge you to just dive a little deeper in terms of the supply chain. Whereas in your head, a product might be adding to a vision of society that looks like the bottom, the reality is this might actually look more like what's presented above. So I urge you to be very critical of information that's being presented to you. Do your desk research and keep asking questions. To sort of summarize all of the research you've seen today, in which my colleagues and co-researchers have put a lot of work into, I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes by Ban Ki-moon, who was 8th Secretary General of the UN. He says that saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are not one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between saving our planet to lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortages, global health, food security, and women's empowerment. Solutions to one problem must be solutions for all. So as we all enter into this sort of quest that we're all on to innovate great solutions, I urge everyone to engage in these systems and support certain institutions, such as sustainable finance, with a critical eye. Not to sort of downplay the importance, but to push it to be better. So as I said, the next time you use your purchasing dollar to invest in a product or service, dig a little deeper into what it stands for, what its values are, and what mechanisms it uses to achieve its bottom line or triple bottom line. So transformation is a process, but the process to transform these systems matters almost just as much as our end goal. Thank you, and I will open it up for questions. Almost.
Congratulations, great presentation. But I was curious, how is it that you got these investors to answer your survey, and which survey names did you use?
Yeah. So I used a connection at a firm, unnamed of course, and they just sent out the email link that I created in SurveyMonkey, and it just kind of went viral, and 35 responses is statistically great. I have Jennifer back there saying, yeah, you did statistics. But it was kind of luck that I got so many responses, and then I also posted the link on a investors meetup page on New York, and I got unanimous or anonymous responses, so no way to track who actually did it.
But how long did it take them to complete the survey?
Oh, the survey itself was only, I mean, you did it. It was like 10 minutes max.
15 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
That's quite a feat to get that many.
Yeah, I was excited.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thanks for bringing this to the forefront of consciousness.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Consider this.
Are there other questions for Irie, James, Gabriella, Elena? Yeah, another one.
I'm sorry, I really enjoyed all of your presentations. Curious though, the whole feminist approach to dress. When I was working in the corporate life back in the late 80s, early 90s, I personally intentionally wore skirts and jackets. It was more of a skirt suit instead of a pantsuit, but intentionally wore that to kind of avoid men looking at me like a sex symbol. I was young then, and so the skirt thing kind of like, they didn't look at me more, they respected me more. So which is kind of, am I maybe interpreting your point of view wrong in that you would prefer women to be more asexual with a pantsuit, or, I don't know if I use the wrong terminology, asexual, I don't know.
Not completely. I think that's it's a very contradictory topic where, in a sense, if you're conforming to this idea of dressing conservatively, then it's like you are trying to prove a point, and then if you are dressing in a more revealing way, then it's like you're going to get a different kind of attention. And so my whole research is more about the fact that we're getting this attention and this commentary no matter what you wear, and that's where the real problem lies. It's not on what you decide to choose to wear.
So after your research, would you recommend women in the corporate world to wear more conservative skirt suits, or in your just personal opinion? Just
Again,
curious.
I think it's the media and the people. We need to change our outlook on how we judge women on based on what they wear.
I see,
And you
yeah.
should be able to wear whatever you want, whatever makes you feel more comfortable.
We have more time to go. To you, Dr. Ross.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Yes,
Question for Gabriella, and I've heard you talk before. So I know marriage is a state law, so that's why each state legislative body has to change it, and you still have 48 states that can allow a child to be put into marriage by, I assume only the parents can do that?
Yes, so as a minor, parents, their legal guardian is what gives them the ability to say if their child can be married or not.
So, you also went through this gay marriage. There were some things at the national level and through a movement of U.S. Supreme Court and definitions there. Is there any effort to get this very important work done nationally so we don't have to wait for every state to decide it's not appropriate to place a child into marriage, since the child can't even exit by choice?
There's groups that are within each state that are working towards it. So there's Unchained at Last, which is a agency specifically working to end child marriage around the United States, in addition to other women's organizations such as NOW. But the issue is, in order to actually have a marriage law passed, legislators have to take that on to change the bill. So in order for it to actually be changed into the law, it has to be brought to the Senate and Assembly floor and drafted into legislation. So I don't
There's
think,
no natural strategy to get this done through.
not to my knowledge,
Through the Supreme Court.
no. It should be, but
Also a question for Gabriella. I find it astonishing that in today's world, with the rights of the child, UN rights of the child, it's not passed yet in the United States, but children have the right to take out a library book and not reveal to their parents which library book they're taking out. Oh, they can't hear me. Oh boy, that changes everything. So children have a right to take out whatever they want from a library and not have parental approval, and they are entitled to privacy in that respect. Children also in our country have a right to any kind of medical care without their parent being there. I don't know, is that a law? Then children in at least the metropolitan area over here, can they go to a doctor and their parent is not entitled to see their medical record? Do you know? I thought that was.
I think it depends on the circumstances, but
Okay.
I think that actually is that.
Yeah, so I find it astonishing that you taught me a lot today, and that where children have so many rights as an individual for other things, but yet they don't have their right to say no, to be kind of sold into marriage. It's astonishing.
It's interesting because it's like contradictory even within how, like I stated before, within the court system, how you have to be 18 to divorce, but then you can be 14, well, previously 14 to be married. So it's just interesting how there's contradictions within the law under the same topic of child rights. So it's just
Exactly.
Yeah.
And do you know in the New York area or the New York State what the age of consent is for abortion?
I think
Sorry, I'm not sure
too
myself.
related to abortion. I think if you went to a medical provider that provided it, I think a doctor can't deny you. I think, but there may be some type of parental consent form that would have to be.
Yeah, I think they was. I was wondering what the age is now, because I know in the past they were changing it, but really astonishing that children don't have the right to decide their fate in marriage when they have so many other rights. So, thank you.
Such a progressive society.
I have a quick question for James. We hear so much about relations between the West and Russia being strained today, perhaps in ways they weren't strained during the Cold War. So where do you land? Are you left with a sense of nostalgia that we should be much more outward looking and have NGOs investing in spreading our ideas about not necessarily the federal government's ideas, but what American people feel are the values of democracy, freedom, the right to liberty and so on, or is that?
I think it depends on the circumstances. So during the Cold War, in this period that I was researching, a lot of what was justifying foreign intervention and foreign aid was ultimately expanding the U.S. economy. So by exporting democracy and capitalism abroad, the hope was that, one, you would prevent Soviet intervention and communism, and two, in the long run, with modernization theories, with lots of modernization theory actually came into academia during the 1950s, during this period that I'm studying. But so through exporting capitalism and democracy and modernizing developing third world nations, eventually the hope was then that they would be able to create their own capitalist economies, which should not rival the US in terms of exporting, but would actually contribute in importing US manufactured goods. So that is, I wouldn't say it is as relevant as it was during the Cold War because of, we're not in that age of American, like newly formed post-World War II global expansion. But for instance, there is this threat and this fear that is very similar, as with like the recent strikes in Syria. There was the justification was that a lot of people and historians have argued is that the reason that these strikes happened were the fear of a possible threat. So there's still that idea of the potential of an actual threat, which is fueling fear, which then dictates global foreign policy decisions.
Thank you. It's close to 3:30. I think all that remains is to thank the 4 excellent presenters. Thank you.